the content that's not integrated with somebody may be very simple or very complex. So it might just be some automatic thoughts or emotions or memory fragments, let's say, that are related to one particular traumatic experience. Or it might be more complex, like mood states, whole perspective on life, or inner voices that have a particular attitude that the person doesn't see as themselves. And then sometimes it can be like whole complex identity states that might be seen as alternate personalities. So that's just dissociation, but once dissociation is happening, the person can make psychotic interpretations of that which has been dissociated when it does intrude into their mind. So, whereas a person who understands that they have, let's say, something like another personality inside themselves, when they hear that personality talking to them, they interpret it as a dissociation. Another person may have a very similar experience, but they'll think, oh gosh, I'm having telepathy with another person. Or, gee, something is trying to control my mind. There's a demon in there, or somebody put a brain implant in. That is not necessarily a totally different kind of process, but a different interpretation of the process that is going on. So, looking at dissociation broadly, dissociation is often just seen as one kind of symptom of something that can happen on a long list of possible symptoms, let's say after trauma. And that's the way it usually is looked at right now in the trauma field. But the alternative I'm going to be talking about, the alternative perspective, is looking at dissociation as something that leads to an underlying self-organization within the person of symptom complexes. So it's basically the underlying factor that explains what's going on with a lot of these symptoms that we see, and it can manifest in a variety of different ways. Now, unfortunately, what I think happens is that our mental health system kind of itself has a form of dissociation going, and that our understanding of dissociation and dissociative disorders has really itself been dissociated from our understanding of other disorders. So when dissociation is less extreme, it's commonly not recognized as dissociation, especially when it occurs like within, mood disorders, depression, or anxiety, Ptsd, etc. And then when people make psychotic interpretations of dissociative experiences, whether simple or complex ones, then the mental health system also typically fails to consider the possibility that the underlying problem may be dissociative. In other words, that there's an underlying problem of dissociation, then the person's making a psychotic interpretation of that, and that's what's going on, rather than it being a completely separate psychotic disorder or illness, as it's often thought of. So basically, what I'm proposing is that the conflict between dissociated parts of the person can lead to most mental disorders. For example, let's start with PTSD, which is commonly understood to be definitely a result of trauma, obviously, and there's often understood that, well, there's some dissociation involved, but here I want to talk about how you can see PTSD as directly resulting from dissociation. So we talked about the A and P EP split, or apparently normal part versus emotional part. The apparently normal part wants distance from the trauma so that it can go resuming daily life. That's what it does. And in wanting to do that, it may develop a phobia of the traumatic memory, because the traumatic memory is very disruptive. Now, on the other hand, the emotional part wants to focus on the trauma. And its purpose in doing that is to prevent a recurrence, to understand what happened and how to not have it reoccur. From the point of view of the emotional part, the apparently normal part, suppression of traumatic memory, is a threat to safety. It's that lack of willingness to look at the trauma is considered a threat. So each part is seeing the other part as a threat. One way of looking at what's going on, and this comes from the metacognitive perspective, which doesn't even talk about dissociation, but can easily be understood as talking about dissociation, because they talk about how the person tends to have positive or tends to have two different kinds of beliefs about what's going on, and I'm calling them positive and negative meta-beliefs. So one of them, from more the apparently normal part's perspective, is beliefs like I must stop thinking about it. It's not normal to keep thinking about the trauma. I must be weak to be responding like this. I could lose my mind if I continue to think this way. My mind's been damaged by what happened. Very much not wanting to have the memory of the trauma present. But from the other side, which is more the emotional part's perspective, there's beliefs like I must go over events in order to make sense of them. It's important not to have gaps in my memory. Thinking about threats in the future will help me cope. Worrying keeps me safe. Paying attention to danger keeps me safe. Now, obviously, each one of these beliefs is true up to a point on either side. But when the beliefs are dissociated, there's not an integration and agreement within the self and how far to go in either direction. Instead, there's kind of like ongoing conflict. Now you see the same kind of thing in other kind of disorders. Let's look at anxiety disorders generally. Anxiety is all about threats. And so the emotional part perceives a threat and gets anxious about it, gets worked up about it. But the apparently normal part, the part that wants to get on with life and isn't so concerned about the threat, sees the emotional part's anxiety as a threat and tries to suppress it. Let's not feel that. Let's not have it. So the apparently normal part is anxious about the emotional part's anxiety. Now, the emotional part, of course, gets anxious that the apparently normal part is going to block it out, and so it won't be able to defend against threat if the apparently normal part is blocking it out. So it produces even more anxiety, and a vicious circle is easily created. So, looked at again from the meta-belief perspective, you can see where people with anxiety disorders have opposite beliefs. In the apparently normal part side, there's beliefs like I could go crazy with worry. Worry could harm me. It puts my body under stress. If I don't control my worry, it's going to control me. Look, my worry is uncontrollable. Oh my God. And from the emotional part's point of view, that other side of the beliefs that people tend to have, worry helps me cope. If I worry, I'll be prepared. Worry keeps me safe. It helps me get things done. Something bad would happen if I didn't worry. Worry helps me solve problems. So whatever, the part of us that's focused on the threat tends to have beliefs like that. The part of us that wants to get rid of the emotional disturbance, on the other hand, the more apparently normal part tends to want to get rid of the worry, and each side kind of like fights with each other. In the depressive disorders, you can see the same kind of thing. The emotional part sees some kind of threatening problem. There's usually some kind of trigger for depression. And what happens is, and there's some articles out about how this is an evolved biological function to have depression. But what it is like we see a problem, we withdraw energy from other areas in order to focus on the problem, and that makes us come across as depressed. We're just not into our normal pleasures or normal things and all that. But from the point of view of the apparently normal part, it's not so focused on the original problem. It sees the depression as the problem and just wants to resume normal activity. Now, from the point of view of the emotional part, that would be resuming normal activity would be a distraction from the problem, and so it resists. Again, you've got a conflict between the two parts. You've also got the same split in two different opposing sets of meta beliefs. From the point of view of the apparently normal part, there's beliefs like, I cannot control my depressive thoughts. My depressive thoughts are a sign I'm losing my mind. They control me. I'm defective and abnormal for having this go on with me. But from more the emotional part's point of view, it's things like, well, rumination helps me cope. If I analyze why I feel this way, I'll find the answers. Rumination helps me understand the depression and what's going on, helps me solve problems. Which, by the way, is to some extent true. Rumination can help us solve the problem, the central problem we're focused on. People are more analytical when they're depressed, and they are better at solving certain kinds of problems. On the other hand, obviously, getting depressed can be really a problem. The apparently normal part is not entirely wrong here either. So both parts have part of the truth, but they're not integrated, and so that's the problem. That's why the person has a hard time getting through it. I mean, if a person is totally doesn't have this lack of integration, then they'll probably be able to just come up with one strategy to work through the situation, and when they feel like they've ruminated enough, they'll just quit ruminating rather than getting in a war between two parts of them, one that is persisting in the rumination and another part that is upset about that and wanting to stop it. So look at something like borderline personality disorder and dissociation, another example. The kind of like structure of that is the apparently normal part sees a need for attachment. From the apparently normal, let's look at it from the, starting in childhood usually when there's trauma. The apparently normal part has learned to ignore abuse so that it can maintain attachment to the caretaker or whatever. But when the fears of being vulnerable get too high, the person switches to their emotional part, which focuses on the need to defend against abuse or against being hurt in some way. And they dissociate their need for attachment in order to defend against abuse. But then when the fear of loss of attachment gets too high, the person again switches to the ANP, which focuses more on the need for attachment. And that pattern, which has been called avoidant oscillation, in adulthood makes people diagnosed with this disorder have really unstable relationships, because they're either really warming up to people, just focusing on attachment, or they're really just being hostile and focusing on defending themselves against perceived threats. And it's very unstable and ultimately very hard on relationships, definitely. So there's a couple different ways that dissociative problems can manifest, and one of them is flipping from one part to another, as we saw in the previous slide. And I mentioned that can be called avoidant oscillation. But the other way is where there's a simultaneous manifestation of both parts within the person with ongoing conflict. And most typically what's going on is the person comes in identifying as the apparently normal part, and they report having the emotional part as a symptom. Oh, I have this depression and I'd like to get rid of it. Though in highly charged situation, the emotional part will just take over. Say the person with an anxiety problem, I wish I didn't have this anxiety, but then when you see them when the anxiety takes over, then it'd be more like, they just believe in trying to get out of the situation they're scared of, rather than trying to get rid of the anxiety. They're just going with the anxiety and letting it direct their behavior.